the record. Um, so for those of you who don't know me, and I think most of you know me a little bit, but not necessarily a lot, my name is Sandra Grudic. I am the administrator for the education outreach program. We call it a Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. And so just to kind of give you a bit of an idea of what we do, and I'll sort of do more of this at the end. But essentially, we provide in-person workshops as well as webinars. And this particular webinar tonight is actually a short version of a day-long workshop that we held on May 9th on Cambridge campus. So we're kind of trying to make this outreach, essentially reach wider audiences. So we sort of replicate some of the things we do in person online to make it possible for people who cannot come in person. And so this is essentially a short version of that. And as it always is with any workshop, it is extremely difficult to do them on Zoom because I don't see you when I present, and then, we sort of do Q&A in the end, just because, to be able to respect the time. But I'm going to soon get started with the presentation, just a brief introduction of what I have done and where I come from. So I've been a classroom teacher, high school classroom teacher for, I think it's 17 years. And I did pretty much anything one can do in social studies for the time period, including, a variety of courses such as American government, world history, AP courses. I did IB, International Baccalaureate, for 10 years as well. And then I decided 5 years ago to do a PhD in history. And I joke about it, but it's probably true. Some people hit 40, like some sort of a midlife crisis, get a car or get a lover. I just decided I'm going to get a PhD, I guess. And so that was that. I did graduate several days ago with a PhD, and now, thank you. And now I'm sort of also speaking from a perspective of a historian. I'm giving this introduction in this way because what I'm going to present today essentially closely correlates to my experience both as a classroom teacher, but also as a historian. And I didn't add in between that one important aspect that I have done while teaching IB curriculum is I also taught something called theory of knowledge. And most teachers, unless you deal with the IB curriculum, have not heard about it. But what is really cool about that curriculum is you speak to these, 16, 17-year-olds about how knowledge is created in every knowledge area. So in this case, how do we go from a primary source to a history textbook in a way? And this is essentially an important component to how I take approach to this analytical approach to primary sources in the classroom. So what I'm going to do, if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Are there any questions at this point? I'm just sort of always aware of everybody's time. But if you don't mind, once I share my screen, as you know, I won't be able to see chat or see your faces. But if you have a question, please stop me, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you may have. I am hosting this alone today. I don't have anybody with me who can monitor. If anybody sees a chat question, you could be my helper and just say, hey, we have a question, stop talking. So we have a total of 90 minutes, and the way I plan this out essentially is that I give you sort of this background of how I approach the primary sources with the students, then show you a couple free resources that I think are wonderful to use in the classrooms, that are free from or open source from the Davis Center and from Harvard University. And then, of course, use this skill that the acronym is OPCVL, and I'll explain what that is, of course, in the meantime. So I'm going to go ahead and find my PowerPoint. Okay, can you all see that? Can somebody say yes? So,
Yes, it's visible.
all right, thank you so much. Okay, all right, I need to, what have I done? I've just hold on. I've done something I wasn't supposed to do. I changed my view of speed. Okay, here. I don't know what I've done. I can't, okay, I'm gonna stop sharing screen and I'm going to, something happened with my view and I see the gallery view. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share screen again. It should be okay. Okay. All right. I have all these little things that I need to move around. All right, so this again is called the teaching and learning about Eurasia with primary sources. And I'm particularly going to focus on this one skill, that's called OPCVL. So my goals today are to discuss the importance of using primary sources in history classrooms. Now, I will say, while I am talking from a historical perspective here, this particular skill can be used really in any classroom with any resources, including different secondary sources. So I would also like to introduce, as I said, some of the resources of the Davis Center and demonstrate this strategy and sort of explain to you in the end with the Q&A what else we can do for you, how can we support you in your classrooms. So the reason why I'm giving or taking this approach today is the following. Typically in a history classroom, what we do is we cover a particular content, whatever it might be, you know, causes of World War II, for example. And then to engage students with more or, you know, deeper content, we usually bring some sort of a primary source. Oftentimes we use written sources, and then we give students the source and have them answer some sort of questions. And that pretty much most of the time closes, you know, how we engage with primary sources. But when you think about it, essentially the entire history is written with using the primary sources. So I start, you know, this discussion with students essentially, how is history written and why is it important to analytically look at all of these primary sources, whatever they might be that we use in history classroom or again in any other class for that matter. So how certain is our knowledge of the past? Do historians have more in common with scientists or with artists? As in, do they actually just follow the facts? How much of it do they have to make up? Is their work purely evidence-based? Is there any intuition involved? And what essentially is considered acceptable evidence to a historian? And then what becomes a part of official history? And while these questions may seem, you know, basic to you, I can guarantee you that most of our students don't think critically in that way about what is in their textbook or provided to them worksheet. So essentially, beginning discussion of how we use primary sources with how did this, you know, whatever you hold in your hand, a textbook or a secondary source arrive to the place where it is the classroom is a really good place to get them start to think. So when we think about writing history, we really need to recognize that history is essentially only present traces of the past. It is not the past. It's a selection of a selection. So when you look at what historians do, they will select from available evidence, and then the available evidence is already a selective interpretation of events. So all historians, no matter what they deal with, they have this advantage of hindsight. They know what had happened. They know how things turned out. And while you may say, well, of course they do, they live in the present, the problem is that they also, their interpretation of whatever documents they encounter is essentially impacted by knowing the outcome. So when you look at this, I'll give you a couple examples here. Also, the division of history into these various periods is influenced by hindsight. Take, for example, I don't know, the division of history into the Middle Ages and then the Renaissance, for instance. There was no clear line. It's not like one morning somebody just, woke up in Italy, opened the windows and said, hello, here comes Renaissance. So this entire classification happened after the fact, after we've seen the development that took place. And then, it was classified and reclassified and named and renamed. When we study, for example, past events, like I'm a genocide historian, so genocide scholar. And for instance, when I look at the subjects that I study, like the Bosnian genocide or the Holocaust, we know the outcome, and then we go back and reinterpret just about anything through a particular lens. The Bosnian War, for example, we interpret as an ethnic conflict, which yes, it was, but then we interpret, oftentimes and by we, I mean historians, but also individuals, every single aspect of the conflict through an ethnic lens, which is essentially wrong. The same things, for instance, a lot of emphasis for the Holocaust is placed on the camps. But, when you ask, a student where were most Jews killed during the Holocaust, essentially automatically comes to the camps. But out of the 6 million people, 6 million Jews that died during the Holocaust, again, all these numbers like estimation, 1.5 million died in the camps. What happened to the rest? Why aren't we talking about the rest? Why this generalization? So again, these generalizations and analysis from the past, these sort of like really show this advantage of hindsight. And therefore, we need to look at these primary sources critically with students as well as, of course, ourselves. And then, of course, as I've already explained, the problem of hindsight bias, we technically look at something bad and we may believe that it was obvious. Again, you see this in history all the time. Why didn't they leave? Why did they stay there? Didn't they know they're going to be bombed? Just because we know, it doesn't mean that historical persons essentially, couldn't know. Again, this is a problem that you see in history all the time. Trying to on, but there we go. So, just this kind of quote I like to use to sum it up, but history is not the past. It is the method we have evolved of organizing our ignorance of the past. And this is really important to point out to our students. Most of the things that ever happened were never recorded. And most of the things that were ever recorded were probably never meant to be used for studying history. So when we look at then the epistemological problems of history, again, you don't want to call them that probably with your students, but essentially high school students, college students, of course, you probably could. But essentially what you're looking at is when we create the field of history, the textbook, the book, what are some problems historians encounter? And so 3 major issues here. Of course, some of them are more obvious than others, but weakness of raw material, such as the sources. Again, as I mentioned, most people who have ever lived and most events that ever happened left no record. I think I was actually thinking about this when I was making this presentation. I think this is changing. And I will, absolutely not be, jealous at historians of the future, like thinking that, the Twitter and Facebook and Instagram essentially will become historical records of everyday life. And that somebody who will maybe 30, 50 years from today will research, say, daily lives in, I don't know, wherever, will need to go through those records. It's essentially scary. There's such an overwhelming amount of data, and it is good, of course, but then too much evidence is also problematic because it becomes difficult, essentially, to even decide what is potentially important. So I think, with the newest technology, the way we do history, I mean, it's already changing, but it will change a lot in the future. So historians always use sources that were never intended for interpretations. Like, we don't think about that, but diaries, letters, unless official, were oftentimes meant to be private sources, yet we have to extract from them information to reconstruct essentially, an aspect of the past. The process of historical research is also problematic. What we don't think about it also, although we may know it, is historical method is an inductive method. It means we look at individual pieces, individual documents or records, photographs, whatever they might be. And from these individual pieces, we essentially create a generalization about something that had happened. So we construct these plausible meanings from the evidence that is left behind. And while, again, as somebody who studies history, I will think about the fact what is not there and what is left out, our students will not. So oftentimes, and I will, demonstrate, give these examples when we sort of go through the skill itself, but oftentimes I sort of tell my students to look for silences. What is not there tells us oftentimes a lot about some, an aspect or a topic that we study. So the silences are also, or can be, seen as a form of evidence of something. And then, of course, the problem is we'll look at these various types of documents. And again, with more modern history, you're looking into videos and photographs and all kinds of audio recordings and testimonies and diaries and governmental documents. And then you're creating generalizations about whatever you're studying. But then you have to essentially spit it out in form of a text. The past was not a text, yet we have to essentially say it like that. Communicate it like that. And that is a huge limitation because language is limited. We can explain things and we can convey a story, which we do. But the point is that it can never be the way the past used to be. So it will always be influenced by the person who interprets it and creates the text, the word choices. And I don't know if you've ever read a book. I've read plenty of them in the last few years, where you sort of are reading a book, a nonfiction book, again, in history or political science, or it doesn't matter, one of the social sciences. And you cannot essentially disagree with the argument that the person is making, but you're bothered. So essentially, this ends up being the problem of what they don't say becomes, again, part of the argument. So the words they use and what is not said. So we're, just kind of like, once I get to this sort of discussion, then I introduce the primary sources and secondary sources. Most students by high school know what these are. Again, primary sources are written by someone who was there at the time. Secondary sources are usually secondhand accounts of what happened. One thing that I like to emphasize and sort of like play with my students is actually ask questions whether, a photograph from the time period when something is happening, say a photograph that captured, a World War I battle scene or a World War II scene, or it doesn't matter, like a woman in the street, whether that's actually a primary or secondary source. The same is true for a video of sorts. And the reason why, again, this is essentially where you have your students tell you why it is and why it isn't a primary source, because they are capturing the moment at the time when something is happening. But at the same time, these are interpretations. They're already interpretations. I mean, all documents are already interpretations, but I think our students are more likely to think that something that was written by the government and archived in an archive or, filed in a folder somewhere and dug up by a historian is more likely to be sort of authentic, sorry, more likely to not, less likely to be authentic, more likely to be manipulated than, say, a photograph or a video, because you feel like you're visually seeing the actual situation. While again, videos and photographs are also just moments that are picked and manipulated in a way to convey a certain message. So it's good to have these sort of like discussions with them, because they typically don't think about it, but then they get intrigued and they like it. So the problems with primary sources, nothing new to you, but again, might be something new to students. Pretty much all primary sources are in some ways already contaminated. Eyewitness issues, perception and emotion of the witnesses will always alter an account. Now, you never, as a historian, will use a single account. Therefore, sort of triangulation, you sort of fix this problem. But again, if there is a single source, it's a huge issue. Social bias is something that most of us as adults and teachers and educators don't even think about, and our students really never think about it, almost never, is that primary sources often reflect the interest of one social group rather than society as a whole. So it gives us a distorted picture. So I think probably one of the easiest examples for students who are, say, who have done some world history, in the past is, for instance, to tell them that we have this perception that, people during the Middle Ages were extremely religious, for instance. And I'm not saying they were not, but there's the impression that everybody was deeply religious. And this comes from the fact that, who was really literate during the Middle Ages? Really only churches and church personnel and monks. And since history is based on the documents left behind, if they were the only ones who were writing the documents, then that's the perception we have adopted as the general understanding of the Middle Ages. Again, this is so-called social bias, because we essentially do not have equal representation of people who lived in, different strata of the society, in any time period, really. Again, things might change once we start looking into social media, but I'm talking about like traditional historical method. And then, of course, the deliberate manipulation. This one is the least surprising. There's always been, I put this photograph here because I think it's in my opinion, really interesting that, Trotsky disappears. And this is, the Russians were doing Photoshop quite well before the Photoshop existence. And essentially many documents have amendments and things taken out before they were archived. So today I want to talk about this particular skill. The acronym for it is called OPCVL. And the reason, again, why I lead you into this in this way is that despite all of these limitations, if properly used, primary sources are extremely valuable. But I think, again, we have to approach all sources with caution. So when we read a source with students, especially, one must consider who wrote it, why they wrote it, what is included, what is left out, and how helpful would the source be to an investigation. Again, this historical investigation component may not be useful to you if you're using this skill just for sort of like an activity. And I'll tell you as I move on, what can you use this skill, or what I have used. You can use it for different things, but what have I used this skill for? So when I say historical investigation, in this case, like if you have students, and I have done this, and this is better, this particular example that I'm about to give is better for older students, even college students or high school students. I would say maybe 11th to 12th grade. And not like the OPCVL itself can be used for any, but this particular historical investigation component, I think better works with more mature students. If you ask them to write a research on anything, and oftentimes we require in high school a certain number of primary sources for them to sort of look for them, to find what it is, to know what it is. And I use the concept of historical investigation whatever they do for this particular research project is a historical investigation. So if you ask them in the process of whatever they're creating as a final product to actually evaluate the sources and not just use them as evidence, this is where this OPCVL skill comes in handy. So OPCVL is an acronym. It stands for Origin, Purpose, Content, Value, and Limitation. And we'll get to more of that in a second. So before we get into it, I just wanted to put this out there because I didn't want to forget it. But for the purposes of evaluating a source, you could do this with secondary sources. You can do this with primary sources, any source. But for the purpose of evaluating a source has no more or less intrinsic value to historians just because it is primary or secondary. So one always needs to focus on specific origin and purposes, and I'll explain what this means. Again, for your classroom, it's probably just important to teach the skill to look at all sources analytically, but when a historian writes a book, for instance, I just finished my dissertation, there is a huge value in the secondary sources as well, what we know so far about something. And then we include primary sources most of the time to demonstrate something new that we found. But for students, there's really no difference except recognition. What is a source and within which context was it created? Because secondary sources are usually created by experts, while primary sources is something that is left behind as a record. So for them, that is important to recognize. So the acronym again, and essentially what is focus. So this skill, I need to introduce it, where it comes from, and I didn't invent it. So as I told you before, I used to teach in the IB program for, I guess, 10 years at least. I don't even remember anymore. And when I started teaching IB history, I encountered this as a required skill for IB history students. IB stands for International Baccalaureate. Some of you might have heard it, some of you might have not. It's in the it's a global educational program, international program, but in the United States, it's typically applied to 11th and 12th grade high school curriculum. And what I encountered was this particular skill, which is an excellent skill to use to evaluate, in my opinion anyways, to analyze and evaluate primary sources, is not known or used in this format anywhere else in history classroom. That means unless you somehow ended up teaching IB, which is very rare in the United States, and then attended a training, which is very expensive, but the school districts pay it. If you have to teach it, you would have really not heard about this skill. So I sort of started sharing first with my colleagues that were not in IB at the time, and then it's sort of like district trainings, and again now here, because I think that it is such a useful skill that can be given to students that function at different levels and can be used for different purposes. And it gives enough structure for the students to essentially systematically attack analysis of a document or a source of any kind. Why does this matter to me in terms of it being systematic? I don't know about you, but I know that when I was teaching in high school, there's constant push by administrators to teach analytical skills, teach student analytical skills, but nobody really tells you how to teach analysis. There's all kinds of rubrics out there with, uses analysis in writing. What does that look like? And so this skill essentially, if you utilize it in writing, which you can, or simply as class activities, by asking certain questions, they automatically apply an analytical approach. So it is systematic in the sense that it simplifies it for the student and for teaching it. But the result is very, in my opinion, pretty high level analysis of these documents. So and I'll go through more questions that are relevant, and I will give you resources, including the PDF of this PowerPoint, so you don't need to worry about writing this thing down. Should have said that in the beginning if you are writing anything down, but I forgot. So the origin stands for essentially how was this document made. And so we're focusing on the author, who wrote it, who published it, if it is a publication. So it could be, again, a private document, but that in itself is important part of how was it created, when was it created, where. This plays a huge role in how we view the other parts of this acronym. So the purpose stands for who was it written for? Is it meant to inform, to persuade, to present a point of view? The purpose is focused on the audience because it makes a huge difference what we say or the content based on who said it and why was it said and to whom. So when you look at a primary source, if it is a letter, well, it's probably meant as, you know, a private correspondence. So what is said is going to be different in a private document between two people than it would be in an official statement that is to attract wider audiences. And I think it's really important for students to sort of ask these questions and look at these documents in this way, because the content is always impacted by the who and the why and the when and the where. So the what, the content, is impacted by the other two. And then we're looking at these values and limitations. Essentially, how does this source help if you're doing like a research project? How is it valuable? What can be known about a particular topic? And then limitations, why is it hindering our knowledge? And again, sometimes there are surprising things that can be values and limitations that you don't expect. And one of them is, you know, the concept of bias, and I'll get to that, but essentially saying that a source is biased is not necessarily, I see a raised hand. Could you just unmute yourself and ask a question, please?
Can you hear me? Yeah,
Yes,
inshallah.
yes,
So my question is about the evaluation of sources.
yes,
Sometimes, not always, but sometimes it's
yes,
important to check the date of publication. But in this model, OPCVL, we don't
yes.
have any date checking system. And my question
We
is
do.
why? We do.
We do. It's the origin. When was it
It's
published? Yes.
okay, okay, that's
Yeah.
origin because this is important. But
Very
sometimes in
important.
history, maybe it's not, but in political
Yeah,
science,
here,
this is crucial.
yeah, it is. You see, so when you look hoop
Oh,
under
when,
origin,
where? Yeah, sure. Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
So it
I see.
is it is essentially referring to when was it written, where was it written, as well as when was it published and where was it
Mhm.
published. Yeah.
Yep.
So that is essentially absolutely important. And thank you for pointing it out because
Thank you.
no problem. And again, like this is, there's sort of like different ways. I will show you more questions that are sort of like relevant to these pieces of the acronym, but they do really attempt at as holistic of an analysis of a source as possible, but also offering, like I said, a very systematic approach. So when we look at values and questions that are relevant to the value, and I, again, use this concept of historical investigation because oftentimes with older students, I would use it as part of a research project, part of a historical investigation. But again, you do not have to even deal with this if you're just doing an analysis of a source for a classroom activity. Again, what is the author's person and how can that perception aid your investigation or whatever we're trying to find an answer to? Was the work particularly well researched? So for instance, you will look at an excerpt from a source, and I'll show you a couple to sort of like demonstrate this example. I mean, I'm not going to show a secondary source today. It's going to be a primary because I want to share our primary sources from the Davis Center. But if you're looking at an excerpt from a book and it contains many details or specific details, you know, it probably looks like well researched. Can you ever know this like 100% For a student in a high school that's looking at an excerpt, probably not. But again, when you do enough of these, they develop this almost comparative assessment of sources, and they can, in that way, decide that this looks at least well researched. Again, if it's a secondary source, is there a value that allows the author sort of like to take a distance? Primary sources often have really strong emotional value. The secondary sources oftentimes take the emotional distance. Now, is this a value or is it a limitation? Of course, it depends what you're trying to find out. So this is why I always use this historical investigation. It will always be tied to what you're trying to essentially learn. So again, if it's a primary source, does it allow the author to provide a viewpoint that no one else can? Is this a value because this person was there and can give us an insight nobody else can, or not many people can? And that's the value of this particular source for whatever, again, we're trying to look into. Limitations are often troubling to students, like difficult to figure out, because they will, as I said, most often go, the source is biased. And then, this is where it ends. But bias in itself is not necessarily a limitation. It can be, but not necessarily, because sometimes a bias tells you information about the author and what they're trying to say. Finding out or feeling the bias may give you more information to understand the source, rather than limiting your knowledge about a particular topic. So what about the source hinders the investigation? Is there sort of like only single point of view, single part of the story? What viewpoint is presented, what is missing? So for, governmental documents that you will often see, oftentimes you see some sort of official point of view, but you don't really understand its effects, for example, or how were, say, regular people that were not part of the administration affected. So again, these types of things, they develop sort of like a good eye for it with time. And I had to underline this and bold it, but you get the point. I don't have to essentially say that. So before I go into the sources and to demonstrate with you together a skill, are there any more questions about sort of like the purpose of this? I will show you and also give you a link to a Google folder with more specific guides on how to approach this skill, because obviously I can, and I'll show it in the end once I'm done demonstrating the resources. But if you have questions about anything that I've said, if there's any something not clear of how to approach this, or if it makes no sense, are there any questions? If so, just unmute yourself, because I can't see anybody. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to show you two different, I will call them, open access databases. One is of photographs, something called Soviet Information Bureau photos. They're open source. And again, you will have this hyperlink, in the folder of resources so you can access it. Meaning, you do access them through the Harvard Library. However, they are open source. You do not need a login for any of them. So I'm just gonna, actually, let me go to the next slide and I'll come back and click, because I just want to give you an idea of what they are. So they are about nearly 6,000 black and white photographs. They depict everyday life in USSR during early Cold War era. So 46 to 49, and some images date between 35 and 45. So one interesting thing about them, they depict everyday life in the Soviet Union, but most of them are actually staged. And so there goes this sort of like really interesting component that you can discuss. Is this propaganda? Is this really everyday life? Like, how do we know? Is this a primary source? What does it say? What does it not say? And so on. It covers all republics, essentially that made up the Soviet Union, including even Mongolia and North Korea. And there are different thematic coverages. So once you're in this database, you can essentially, for example, for our website, I oftentimes because I put website material for outreach program, and I want like photographs from, schools and education. And then I will go into this and say, schools or students, or, some keywords that are associated with whatever I want to find images about, and then it sort of like filters them out. So you can search this database for particular topics. And again, there are all kinds of different topics: industry, transportation, agriculture, science, and so on. Like you can, read on. And so there's also some prominent figures from the time period and so on. So let me just click on it so you kind of see if it will work. Will it take me out of here? I think I have to stop sharing my screen for a second. And then I'm gonna click it, and then I'm gonna share my screen again. Now I seen you all for a second. Okay. So why is it doing this? Okay. Here we go. I will share my screen in just a second. I just wait for it to open. All right. It's right. Okay. All right, so the link that is provided on the power, you can see it, right? Yes.
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you, Brett. Okay, so when you sort of like click on the link, it brings you here, and then you can see there's like tons of photographs. And once you click on any one of them, and again, you can search, you can add a search term of whatever you want, like Soviet Information Bureau, agriculture, for instance, and then it filters the images. I'm just going to click on one of them to show you what it looks like. Soviet Georgia celebrates. Okay, I don't know what Soviet Georgia celebrated, but let's take a look. And so what you get is the front and the back. And so when you click on the image, you can see here, you can download them in whatever size you want to use in your PowerPoint. And then, there goes the image. And then the other part, the other image is essentially the description that is in the back, and it is in English. And so it tells you who did the photo. Oftentimes when, if not in the back, it will say so in the information, the library, essentially information. So record. Why is it here? That's not what I wanted. But anyways, you get the point. So the idea is that you can search for any of these images, whatever you may need for your classroom in terms of the Soviet history. I need to share again. Hold on a second. This whole sharing business confuses me. Okay, here we go. All right. So why are these, again, easy and friendly for classroom use? So many numbers, large number of images, diversity of subjects, and then most have this English translation, oftentimes even a blurb that explains something, and all of them have been digitized, and so it's easy access. So what I wanted to do is pick a source, and this is one I picked. So it says on here, so this is a photograph, and the little description says Zarya Collective Farm. It says the collective farm's second power station of 200 kilowatt capacity was built during the recent war. Electricity is widely used on the farm. The experiments in power farming conducted in the Zarya fields in the autumn of this year were successful. A view of the machine room of the collective farm power station. And then it says photo, the number, and then August 1947. And so you could essentially show this photograph, and I typically construct a question something like this. I'll go back to the photograph in a second, but what are the values limitation of the source? So you could just insert whatever source of this photograph regards to the origin, purpose, and content when we're researching the daily life of workers in the USSR. So workers on the collective farm in this case. So, this information about the origin, when was it captured? Who was it captured by? And it is important in this case, if you're using a database like this, to explain what it was. So again, these photos were ordered by the government. This particular photographer was employed by the government to take pictures of whatever they were taking pictures of. That plays a role. So this includes, not just the origin, but we're getting into sort of like, who is my intended audience, but also what type of source it is. This is not just any photograph. This is obviously something that is potentially staged. So I would essentially ask my students, first the origin and then the purpose as far as they can tell it. So what's interesting about this tool, analysis tool, is that sometimes you just don't know. Sometimes you can't tell from the excerpt or from the source. So you have to assume, but you assume not in the way to claim it. They may say something like, well, again, since this was ordered by the government, it could be staged. Now, when we look at value and limitation of learning about the everyday life of workers is, well, if it is staged, this really limits what we can learn of how regular worker, conducted work on any given collective farm, because we don't know what regular is if it is staged, right? So this automatically sort of leads to one thing connects to the other thing. And then when you get into this content, the what, in terms of a photograph, you sort of like looking what can be seen. So this obviously looks like a very orderly place. It's clean. There's a huge machine. There is one worker there. There's, Comrade Stalin over there in the background, even plants, in a workroom. And so you kind of like have them go detail by detail to sort of, what does this tell us? So what is at least trying to tell us if it's staged, right? And then, you sort of connect this. What I typically ask the students, what I would ask them to do is essentially, write all of these in bullet points. Okay, who, when, where, all of these things, the what, the many whats, and then think about why is this limiting our knowledge of everyday life for workers on collective farms in Soviet Union, and what is the value of that? So again, there is in sources like this, when you're trying to learn, in this case, just about everyday life of a regular worker, there's probably more of a limitation. Value might be difficult to see, but they still did exist somewhere. So even if we don't learn about everyday life, what do we learn about? We learn about what the government wanted us to think everyday life of workers was. So that also tells us about the mentality and the purposes of this government and of this entire collection. So these are the kinds of things you want them to extract. Are there any questions about this particular photograph or collection?
I don't have a question exactly, but I'm thinking as you're talking, I'm thinking like it's a great window into these topics, these photographs, and that you could see if one has the time, which I feel like is always the challenge in teaching history, to use this as a jumping off point to dive deeper into say, okay, so what did collective farms actually look like? Like what might be some things that were, pretty accurate about this picture, but what's miss as you said before, like what's missing, like have them doing the research after they
Exactly.
brainstorm it to actually see what would be missing.
Exactly. And the reason why I picked this particular photograph for today is because you can actually pair it with other documents. So the other source that I want to show you, open source, And you can also do very similar thing that you can do with the photographs. It's sort of like keyword searchable, but it's a completely different source. It's and then you can pair them up by topic and actually sort of like analyze both and compare contrast, sort of like leading into, well, what do we learn from here and not from here, and why? And the why is always depending on who wrote the source, when was it written, why was it written, right? So it's like kind of like makes these like almost like mini analytical essays that you could do in maybe 20-30 minutes or 20-minute activity. So it just depends. Like I think it could be used in the way you said as an introductory activity, but it could be also used again once you've already covered some of it, and sort of like this comparative analysis almost. I think that might work as well. But yeah, good point. Very good point. Okay, so I already did this. So again, you could have and I'll show you the resources that I have, like the handouts that you could give to your students. But essentially I would have them write these lists, who wrote it, when, why, when was it published, or when was it, the picture taken, by whom, and so on. What is the value of that? What is the limitation of that? What we're trying to learn, in this case, the everyday life of a worker in Soviet Union on a collective farm. And the same for purpose and content. And then again, these could be just little bullet points that can then be structured into a paragraph. And I'll give you a particular worksheet that allows the students to do all of that in one piece. So the second, just to check down, okay, we're good with time. The second sort of like resource is this Harvard project on the Soviet social systems. It's the HPSSSSS. I always, there's so many S's there. This is another wonderful, wonderful resource. And before I click on it to show you what it looks like, I'll just tell you a little bit more about it, like I did with the last one. So this is actually really cool. I discovered this first time when I just started working with the Davis Center, and I was like, this is so amazing. It's overwhelming, first of all. But so somebody asked me during the in-person workshop, would you give this to students to browse through? I'm like, I mean, they can. There's nothing bad in there that would be inappropriate. But the point is, it's so overwhelming. So I personally would prefer using it as you find the excerpt that you want them to analyze, unless you want them to, use, I don't know, say 10 of these interviews or excerpts from these interviews to write a paper or something, then, give it to them and let them find it. But overall, it's 707 interviews in the English language. They're transcripts. They were conducted with Soviet refugees during the early years of the Cold War. So this was done by the Harvard Davis Center, research, at that time it was called Russian Research Center, between 1950 and 1953. So this was sort of the basis of this intensive research that the center has done, and, sort of like the Soviet Union, on the Soviet Union, US during the Cold War. And so all of these transcripts are digitized and turned into this open access full text searchable database. And so I'm going to go, I have to again stop sharing screen because otherwise I cannot show you, but I have to click on it. Okay. All right, here we go. Okay, so this is what it looks like. And so what's the website itself? And so you can sort of like read more, share parts with the students about the collection and so on. But what is interesting about it is, and I, again, myself as a teacher, I would read up on it before I would introduce it to my students, because it helps, just like the SIB collection, to understand that, there is something about how this collection was made that impacts what the content of this entire collection is. So in this case, what is really interesting is that these individuals were interviewed, but the interviews were simultaneously translated. So the simultaneous translation can, go wrong every which way. It is happening at the same time. It's not like it's being recorded and then somebody sits down and transcribes it and then translates the transcription. It's an extremely slow process. This is essentially, you have a bunch of Harvard scholars interviewing these individuals and are, writing notes and typing essentially these notes and translations. However, it is extremely unique source of the study, and you can type any keyword or phrase here. So say, for example, I type in collective farm. And then I just click go. And then it gives you, out of these 700 interviews, basically pages where anybody talks about the collective farm. Again, it's a bit time consuming first time you use it and you figure out, like, you get better with essentially finding what you want in a way. But what is really nice, that does give you, doesn't give you the name of the person, but it tells you their demographic information. Like, for example, female, 37, Ukrainian collective farm worker, male, 50, Great Russian planner. Again, who is given the answers is essentially known to you in most of the instances. So when you click on one of these, again, it provides pages where this collective farm is talked about, and it does kind of sort of point out. So it points to page 8 because that's what I clicked on. I want to know about the collective farm. It does give you the rest of the pages, but it only points in this case to where you want to look. And if you want to download this particular page, you go ahead and just download it, and it saves it in PDF. So again, you can look for any other subjects. It takes a bit time to get used to how it works, but you can look for education, you can look for working, you can look for political situation, religion, all these keywords that might be relevant for whatever you're doing in the classroom. And then you do these little excerpts. So I'll show you an excerpt that I sort of like pulled out on the collective farms that I wanted to pair with this photograph that I had before. And again, you could use these side by side. I need to share my screen again. Once I find it. Okay, here we are. Okay, so I already said this. And why is it useful in the classroom piece? It's a full text search, offers quick access to really vast amount of unique data. Like, this is something that, and again, it takes a bit of time to curate it. And if you need help with that, you can always contact me. And if I get stuck, I will ask Svetlana. She's our librarian. But if you need something that you want us to get for you, I'm happy to do it. They're all in English, and they have this framework which you can read about to understand more. Once you get it, it works wonderfully. And it has lots of depth and breadth about the daily life in the Soviet Union. Again, perception of these refugees. And this is the key. They were all refugees. So they left. And they were interviewed by American professors. So that, understanding that gives the students the possibility to also analyze these texts in different ways. So this is, again, something that I took out, and I sort of highlighted it just so we can see it better. This is part of that first one that we clicked on, but just a different page. It's a female Ukrainian 37 collective farm worker. Again, if you know anything about this time period, and if you teach about this, a collective farming was not well received in Ukraine. So there is something right there. We can assume something about, her and why she's saying certain things. So she's saying our collective farm had no trucks of its own until 1940 for hauling grain. But in that year, it purchased a 3-ton truck. We had to rent all of our tractors from the, I think, MTS until 1940, when the farm purchased 2 tractors. Oh, and then, you know, she tells about them. I do not know what they paid for the use of the tractors. However, the drivers received 3 kilograms of grain and 3 rubles for each trodden, and each working day, I can't see it very well, was a trodden for them. We collective farmers received only 1 kilogram of grain, and so on. So the point is, like, I need to read it to you. The importance here is very, very different view of a collective farm than this clean-cut photograph with huge machinery. And we're looking at, you know, similar time period too. And so, you know, well, who is this woman? Why is she telling us? And oftentimes, you know, you see also these questions in parentheses that the scholars ask them, you know, how much machinery did your farm use? And, you know, sort of you get this different angle of almost opposite angle of what, say, this photograph was showing. And so again, you can go through the same process here that you did with the other one. And what are the values and limitations? You can structure these questions however you want. I was just kind of using sort of like a model to demonstrate. But again, what is the origin? So we know that this was, you know, an interview, a person was interviewed for this particular project in, you know, early Cold War years. I think there were many of them were interviewed in Germany after leaving the Soviet Union. What is the value of us knowing, you know, that these are the people who lived there and left? Well, again, obviously, they're talking from their experience. They've been through it. But then limitation is, who are they, right? Like, they were refugees. They left because they didn't like it there. So they're more like, so these kinds of things, like, and you have to have kids sort of extract this, like tease it out. But it is, it does become sort of like almost a second nature to them to look at the sources like that after you've done it enough. And so same thing, you know, the content, you're looking at how this is constructed and what is being said, as well as its content and purpose are really intertwined in this source. You know, you see the questions, you know, they're using this for research, but then it's also intimidating. You're like in the same room with these professors who are like telling questions to you, but you're like a refugee. You don't know, you know, what's going on, where you're gonna go. It's an unsafe environment, and the cold. It's in the middle of the Cold War. The when, or the beginning of the cold. The when plays a huge role. What is safe to say where? And you're already left. So these kinds of things are really important, again, to sort of like look deeper. So couple more things, and then I think I'm maybe 10 minutes, and then I'll open it up to questions if there's anything I can clarify. But for more complex assignments that you could use with this, is I use them with older students and with college students. So I would say maybe 11th, 12th grade, and again, college students, any age, for primary source analysis essays. So it's actually interesting, when I started using this model, is, you know, I would give students options and say, you could either do a research paper or you could do a primary source analysis essay. And I would include like a complete explanation what it meant. But they were always afraid to go for the primary source analysis essay. And I would always say, well, if you're not sure what it meant, like, you know, sit down with me and I'll explain it to you. And then usually by the time they understood that, they would need, like, I would say, you know, you need to choose 3 or more, like, you know, for younger students, I would limit how many, like maybe 3 to 5 primary sources of their choice. But, you know, usually I tell them that they're thematically related in some way. And then that, you know, they can essentially write an essay analyzing those sources in this way, like using this OPCVL model. And then I sort of would lay out these questions for them to more or less be able to sort of like hit the right angle and connect, you know, what is being said in this source, or what is being portrayed in the source, as being dependent on who wrote it and when was it written and why was it written and for whom. And so So I usually tell them like primary source essays take longer time to think about, but actually shorter time to research and write. Whereas your, traditional research papers take longer time to research and write because you're usually dealing with more voluminous evidence. So this is something that I think can work really well. Like I said, with any student, I personally have experience using it with, again, older high schoolers or college students. I've never taught middle school, so I would not know whether it would work or be too complex. So, if you are, try it out. But again, with high schoolers and college students, it's wonderful. Once they get it, they actually like to do it more than the traditional research assignments. I usually give it as an option in this particular format. You can also use this as an in-class activity. So when you want students to practice simply any kind of analysis of primary sources, you can use it as test items. You can simply say, with reference to its origin, purpose, and content, analyze the value and limitation of this source for somebody studying, or what do we want to know about whatever specific topic. And then there is a structure of how to write a paragraph. I'll show that to you in a second. You can teach your students literally if you wanted it like that. Again, people have different preferences. With younger students, it's super structured. This is how you analyze it in 2 or 3 paragraphs, or a larger paragraph might work. With older students, I think more in-depth is better. But these are some examples. So I'm thanking you, but I'm not done yet, but thank you anyways. I'm going to stop sharing to show you what I have in the Google Drive, and then we open up the questions. So I can, I'm going to paste this link in the chat. What did I do? Hold on. Okay. So you can open it yourself. And again, this particular presentation is in the Google Drive with all these links, but let me just chat. And let me know. I think I opened up everything that everybody can use it, whoever has a link. But if you can't, let me know right away. So I need to change it because I think I did, but who the heck knows? Okay, so let me click on it. Okay, I'm gonna still share screen just so we can look at some of these together. This is essentially what it should look like. The webinar May 2000, why is it 24? I'm still in the wrong year. I'm gonna rename that. Okay. This is essentially the presentation, right? So this is an OPCVL handout that essentially explains the entire process as a handout. So again, if you wanted to use this with your students to sort of like explain the process, to introduce the skill, you could. You could also use it to share with colleagues or for yourself to just kind of like gain more clarity. This is sort of the thinking strategy chart that I said is very, very structured, but it might help in the teaching process of how to approach it. Again, the origin, the box for purpose, content, and then values and limitations. And this is if you have students that struggle with like formulating these types of analysis or analytical paragraphs, you can essentially, provide these little fill in the blanks in the beginning sentences that they can, follow a format. Again, I'm not saying teach this in a very formulaic way. I'm just saying this may help with certain populations. And it may help in the beginning stages of how to teach this. This is also, it's now, once you print it, it's the right way, but this way you have to kind of twist your head. But it essentially gives you different types of sources and sort of, gives different kinds of questions you can ask. And essentially what could be the values limitations of that. So this could help you, construct maybe rubrics for certain assignments. It goes pretty much through everything. You can even like use it to teach your students how to look at different types of sources and what are the possible values or limitation in general of this particular type of source. And then they have to specify with you know, a specific source you assign. But again, it's really helpful to, once you start working with this, you get, like, if you use this on a regular basis with your students, you get so good at it, you don't need it. But I think it's really helpful once you're just being introduced with the skill. This is another one that, again, explains it in a briefer way, sort of, again, if you want to share with students or, and this is just sort of a purpose. Kids typically have more issues with purpose than origin, because it looks at, you know, the why and, you know, the audience and all of these things. You know, the origin is oftentimes specified, you know, the who, the when, published by whom, but the purpose, there is this, you know, this is when you really begin the analytical component. So, you know, this is just kind of gives you general, you know, different types of purposes and what does that mean in terms of what can that be, how it can be valuable for whatever it is you're researching. Again, I think it's really helpful when you start out with the skill. And so again, the link